All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for clicking on this video. Today we have the results of a poll that I posted on the channel 3 or 4 days ago. It is the question: which version of Mortal Kombat is best, the Super Nintendo version or the Sega Genesis version? Now, this came out 33 years ago. It's been a while, but this has been a topic of debate for years and years. People are very opinionated on this one. People have their opinions and their preferences. So I figured it would be fun to just do a community post and see once and for all what you, the viewer, prefer for the home version of Mortal Kombat 1. So I got the results in front of me here. If you look to your left, that is the wrong picture. If you look to your right, there you go. You'll notice that the results for the poll are out of 2,100 votes, 68% chose the Sega Genesis as the better version. Translated, that is about 1,450 out of the 2,100 votes prefer the Sega Genesis version. So what's the difference between these two versions? There's quite a bit. Obviously, you've played the games. You know that the Super Nintendo does not include blood, and the fatalities are different. But a huge issue with the Super Nintendo was the lag, the latency for the controls. Horrible controls in this game. Now, it was easy to get used to. When we were young, we got used to it, no problem. It was a really fun game because of that. The Sega Genesis version, however, the graphics weren't quite up to par with the Super Nintendo. The sound effects were different, the music was different, but it had the blood code and it had the fatalities from the arcade. This seems to be the biggest issue. No, you know what? It doesn't. The biggest issue is the control. The control for the Sega Genesis version is great. Now, this is just my opinion. I asked for comments. If you have, your opinions and comments and such in regards to these, then let me have them. I got a lot of good feedback from your comments, so thank you very much for commenting on this poll. I do appreciate it. So what we're going to do, because the Genesis version wins, we're going to do a playthrough of the Sega Genesis version, and during this playthrough I'm going to show many comments from you, the viewer, that were submitted, and I'm going to read these comments in regards to why the Sega Genesis version is better, in fact, than the Super Nintendo version, according to you. So if you participated, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I'm going to be doing a lot of these kind of comparison style videos where you, the viewer, help out. And that being said, you know what? Let's get into some gameplay and let's read some of the comments as to why the Sega Genesis version is better. Once again, thank you for clicking on the video. Let's get into some of that gameplay. All right, so first things first here, the Sega Genesis has this script at the beginning of the game, beginning with the word code, has many different definitions, etc., etc. So this is where you implement the well-known blood code. What is that blood code? Well, we got a few comments about it. The first comment I'm posting here, Wilford IV, says, Sega all day, ABACABB. We implement that. There you have it, the infamous blood code. Now, along with this infamous blood code, you have another code that you implement right here. Michigan Jack 1337 says, don't be a dullard. If you know, you know. Dullard, down, up, left, A, right, down, brings up this cheat menu right here. And that's another way to implement blood into this game. All right, so character select screen. Let's get into reading some of these comments. The first comment here comes from Otaku Spielplatz. Now he says, Genesis, even without the blood code, because it played way better and had some amazing exclusive background music. And you were not wrong. The Sega Genesis definitely controlled better.
Regardless of whether you were using a 3-button or a 6-button controller, the Sega Genesis did handle better in gameplay. As for the background music, you were not wrong about that one either. The background music is actually pretty darn catchy. All right, next up, we got a great comment here coming from Mr. Gene Dancing Machine. I like the name. He says, I was a slave to aesthetics. Even though Sega had the blood, I couldn't get over how bad it looked. SNES always looked closer to the arcade, which is what I fell in love with in the first place. Now, you make a good point there, Gene. When we got these ports for our home consoles, we wanted them to look and play as close to the arcade as possible. The Sega Genesis didn't have the ability to produce as many colors as the Super Nintendo. It definitely looked better on the Super Nintendo, in my opinion. However, this version is very gritty. It's gritty looking, and it's darker, in my opinion, too, which, makes the Sega Genesis still a very beautiful version of Mortal Kombat. So thank you for that comment, Gene. All right, our next comment comes from Sean Diddy Combs 603. All right, I added the Diddy. My bad. He says, SNES had the graphics, but that wasn't what Mortal Kombat was known for. I had for my SNES, but I hated that it wasn't the complete experience. A lot of people share your opinion, Sean. The SNES, once again, missing the blood and the fatalities made this version of Mortal Kombat almost completely different, because that's what was shocking, and that's what got our attention back in the arcades. I agree with that, Sean. Thank you very much for that comment. Now we have a great comment here coming from DJB1GE. Interesting name. He says, not only was the SNES version censored, but its gameplay is super stiff when compared to the Genesis or arcade versions. It's got the better graphics and sound, though I prefer the matte furnace Genesis arrangements of the music personally, but my vote will always be with the Genesis version. And then he mentions the Master Linque's Arcade Edition ROM hack, which even further cements this for me. It's cool that you mentioned the ROM hack version. After this version was released, obviously there were many versions made by fans of the game. They were called the ROM hacks, and I've played several of these, and they're very good. But you definitely bring out some good points there, Mr. D. So thank you for posting that. So the next comment here comes from my buddy Slide3383. He says, I am divided. MK SNES brings me back to a time where I'd spend a lot of time with my cousin discovering the game after my mom rented it for us for the weekend shortly after its release. MK Genesis, on the other hand, reminds me of my friend Steven, who was extremely excited to show me the blood code and all the fatalities the way they were intended to be. He also mentions that he sadly passed away about a decade ago. Ultimately, MK is about blood, so Genesis had the edge, in my opinion. First things first, condolences to your friend who passed. I'm sorry to hear that. In regards to the game itself, now, you bring up nostalgia, and that's a huge part of why we prefer one version over the other. For myself, my nostalgia goes more with the SNES version. Does this mean that the version is better? No, it doesn't. But nostalgia does play a big factor in how we look at these games still when we play them today. And I think you bring out a good point there. Once again, the blood and the arcade-accurate fatalities make a big difference when it comes to this version, as well as the controls. So, thank you very much for that comment, Slide. I do appreciate it. Next up, we have a very thought-provoking comment coming to you from K1F1L, also known as Ellen Ripley. She comments, Genesis. Fair enough. Enough said right there. Thank you very much for that comment, ER. I do appreciate it. All right, this next comment is a pro SNES comment. This comes from Downhuman74, he says, despite the lack of blood and original fatalities, the SNES version was preferred among me and my friends. It played and sounded better. Some of the altered fatalities were pretty funny too. Now that is interesting that you say it played better than the Sega Genesis version. I'm curious as to when the last time you played this version was, because it definitely doesn't play better. Now, the thing is, when we're young, we adapt quickly. And when this game came out, like I had mentioned for myself, I adapted to it pretty quickly, and it ended up being a really fun version to play. However, if you visit it 30 years later, you realize that the latency in controls is a huge issue. So this might be one of those comments that has to do with the whole nostalgia factor. He's remembering the playing it with him and his friends, and because of that, once again, says it sounds and plays better. Speaking of the alternate fatalities, also on the Super Nintendo, the funny ones I believe you were talking about are Johnny Cage's foot in the chest, as well as Kano pulling out a black sack of dirt out of your chest instead of your heart. Those ones were kind of funny. The Sub-Zero and Raiden fatalities on the SNES, however, I thought they were pretty cool. So I like that you touched on that in your comment. Thank you very much for that. As you can see, I just suffered a loss at the hands of Kano, but the music in that stage was absolutely epic. Which brings us to another topic of discussion. Once again, the sound. Let's check out a comment. This one comes to you from Garrett DeGico, who says, I might be biased because I grew up with the SNES one, but I like its official soundtrack better than the Genesis. So, that being said, you know what? About a year or so ago, I thought the same thing. But the Sega Genesis music, because I started playing it more, really grew on me, and I find some of the best music in any home console version, even modern, is on the Sega Genesis. I think Goro's stage music is probably my favorite from any of the home ports. So thank you for that very direct and to-the-point comment. I do appreciate it. So on the topic of sound again, Enigma Master 84 says the best soundtrack of all versions on the Mega Drive. Responsive controls, passable graphics. Still my favorite version and way to play it. I enjoyed DOS and obviously arcade as well. So touching on that soundtrack again for the Sega Genesis, I'm telling you, a lot of people love this soundtrack. You either love it or hate it, I find. In which I thought I didn't like it over the last year, so I really grew to like it. So touching on the responsive controls, again, absolutely. Controlled much better than the Super Nintendo. As for passable graphics, I think the graphics are above passable, so I am going to disagree with that statement, but I think the game looks great, especially on a CRT. If you're playing on original hardware, looks fantastic. Thank you for that comment. So this next comment I find to be very controversial. This is coming to you from Vone. Now, Vone, first things first, I just want to say thank you for all the comments on my videos. I do see you show up quite often in the comments, and while I don't get to reply to all of them, I do appreciate it. Vone says the Genesis version is more playable, but the Super NES version does have better graphics, which the Sega version will never have in its many conversions. But this comment here, I also like the deep freeze fatality more than the spine rip. That is the first time I have ever heard that. To me, the spine rip fatality of Sub-Zero's is the greatest fatality from any Mortal Kombat game, especially the classics. So I find it very interesting that you had mentioned that the deep freeze fatality is better. I'm actually going to have to do a poll on this and see what the audience thinks of this as well. So, Vone, thank you for that comment. Very controversial. I do appreciate it. So right here you see I'm battling the first endurance match. These endurance matches killed me. They killed me in this game. This one and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, I'm telling you, they were not the fun portions of the games, in my opinion. Having to take out two opponents, especially depending on the computer difficulty, was always a pain in the neck. So, anyways, let's take a look at another comment. 8589 Brian says, Graphically, the SNES version was superior, but the Mega Drive Genesis version was more accurate due to a code, Dullard, which made the gore more akin to its original arcade counterpart. Gameplay, the SNES version was slightly smoother and the sound was closer to what you would hear in the arcade, but without the gore, is it really Mortal Kombat? Very interesting, very interesting. The part that sticks out to me here about this comment is your gameplay, the SNES version was slightly smoother. Once again, I don't agree with that because of the latency with the controls, which has me questioning whether or not you've played it recently. So again, the main theme of these comments seems to be the sound, the gameplay, the graphics. I mean, all the things that make these games what they are. The latency on the controls for the Super Nintendo, just again, to pick it up and play it now, as at the same time as picking up the Sega Genesis version and playing it now, the controls are night and day, I find. So, once again, agree to disagree. I do appreciate the comment. Thank you very much. The name is Quickman, obviously a fan of Mega Man 2, says the SNES version just controls so weirdly. As someone who always cares about gameplay above all else in a fighting game, the Mega Drive Genesis version won even without the question of blood. It's also why I prefer the Mega Drive Genesis Street Fighter 2 to the SNES Street Fighter 2, even though it's closer. The gameplay is slightly more accurate, arcade accurate on the Sega. The original music done for the Mega Drive is also fantastic, which helps. So there you have it. Once again, the controls, Mortal Kombat controls better for the Sega Genesis. And again, I like that you touched on the original music for the Mega Drive being fantastic, because, my friend Quickman, I do agree. Thank you for that comment. All right, we have a very interesting comment here. Says, poo-poo, pee-pee, caca, doo-doo, dookie, poop, bum, barf, wiener. Oh, you know what? Never mind. That's just me trolling myself. Let's get that out of here and focus on a real comment. I'm sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this next comment reminds me of myself years ago. This is something I would have said. Brian McDonald 7017 says, anyone saying Genesis is objectively wrong. It looks, sounds, and plays objectively wrong. It has the blood code. That's it. I had it on Genesis. My cousin had it on Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo was the superior port in every meaningful way. When I was younger, I said the same thing. I did not own it for the Genesis, but I was, I guess you could say, biased towards the Super Nintendo, and I just said this one was better. And you know what? Like I've said before, I did enjoy it on the Super Nintendo. But being able to look at it now in a different light, because I played both of them several times on hardware on the CRT. Again, my preference is the Genesis version. So Brian, I gotta say, while I appreciate the comment, that's for sure, I get it. I get what you're saying in this comment as well. We are all entitled to our opinions, and I respect yours. So thank you for that comment. I did notice, too, that there were about 12 replies on it, so it looks like people in the community were interacting with this comment as well. So very good, very well done. Thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Raziel Pliskin says, sorry, I answer based solely on nostalgia. My vote goes to the SNES. Now, based on nostalgia, my vote goes for the SNES too, because that's the one I definitely have more memories of back in the day. However, looking at it from a more open viewpoint, I gotta say the Genesis version is my favorite now, based on the fact that I've played it a lot more in the last year, and I'm able to look at it in a different light. So, straight into the point, I appreciate your comment. Let's take a look at another one. Bill Wu 21377 sums it up very quickly. Genesis was better for one reason. SNES had horrendous input delay. That's a big factor right there. We've talked about it over and over and over again. The input delay, the latency on the controls for the Super Nintendo are ultimately what ruined the game. and make the Genesis version better. Thank you, Bill Wu, for that comment. All right, so here we go, Shang fun time. Before I open up a couple more comments, I want you to watch this for a second. Take a look at what happens here. So, starts flickering, hits the blue screen. That is the, and then I get my butt kicked by Shang Tsung. Unfortunately, while doing this playthrough, my controls on the Sega Genesis there, the connection to the TV got kind of loose. Not sure why. But that happens on my Sega Genesis every once in a while, as well as my Sega Saturn. So I don't know if that was an issue back in the day with the connection on the back of the Genesis and the Saturn, but that's what happened right there. So let's take a look at one or two more comments and then conclude this video. All right, this comment coming to you from MK Braga. The Genesis version has aged better. Since the graphics of both versions are outdated by today's standards, what's left is the gameplay, and in this regard, the Genesis wins 10-0. You make a very good point here, MK Braga. The graphics of both versions are outdated by today's standards. If a game doesn't play well, then what's the point? What's the point in visiting it if there are so many other versions and options to play at your disposal? So, this one plays a lot better than the SNES version, and because of that, MK Braga, I'm going to have to say I do agree with your comment. Thank you very much for it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so there you have it. A lot of good comments. To those that did comment, I really do appreciate it, and basically helped out with this video by doing so. So, as we've read, and as we can see in the gameplay here, very cool ending, by the way. The Genesis takes it because of, ultimately, people's preference in what they hear. I think while both versions sound great, they are different, and because of that, it's based on preference. Now, the one thing you can't deny is that the Sega Genesis version does control better. It's more responsive. There's no real latency in the controls, and because of that, I think, in my opinion, that is the ultimate reason why the Sega Genesis wins. While the Super Nintendo version has great graphics and color and such, it just doesn't compare and compete when it comes to the controls. And again, the removal of the blood from the Super Nintendo version, that was a big deal. Mortal Kombat was very controversial back in the day. The Super Nintendo version was not at all controversial because it was dumbed down so much. So, thank you very much for checking out the video. I do appreciate it, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day.